Hi everyone, Ian Aldridge from Progressive Legal today, talking about the benefits of incorporating to a proprietary limited or some separate legal entity from a sole trader. What I find is most businesses don't move from a sole trader to a separate legal entity fast enough. They get advice from a whole bunch of people saying, "Oh, just start out as a sole trader and see how it goes, and then you can move later on." Unfortunately, business gets very busy and that gets in the way of that, or they get accounting advice that says just start as a sole trader, and then once you reach a certain financial or tax sort of level, and each accountant has their own sort of level, that they then tap you on the shoulder and say, yes, it's time now to incorporate to a proprietary limited to get advantages of the tax, and other sort of financial advantages. The difficulty is if you're doing anything that's risky, and all business is risky, that's why they call it risky business. You need to get some legal advice about whether this business has enough risk that warrants going to a proprietary limited right from the start. So for those businesses that are, and I think any business that's conducting business to business services, there's automatically a higher level of risk. So I think the question you need to ask yourself is this truly a hobby? Or, is this a hobby with very little risk? And if the answer to that is no, this is a serious business, this is where I want to go, then you should be looking to incorporate the business to a separate legal entity sooner rather than later. And it's much better to do it at an early stage of a business so you can get used to the requirements of tax returns and any of the quarterly BAS, etc., and getting used to being a director of a company. It's not as scary as you might think, or different to being a sole trader. When you're a sole trader, you and the business are one and the same person, and that's the ultimate downfall of a sole trader. It's the same with partnerships. You and your partners are equally liable, jointly and severally, for the business and what happens. You're also liable for what your other partners do, which is even more scary. So it's so important to make sure, if you are entering a partnership, that you consider a separate legal entity, a company structure, where ultimately at the end of the day, the shareholders are only liable for the unpaid value of their shares. And normally the shares are not worth much when a business is formed. So, and then you've got directors' duties individually to do what's in the best interest of the company, and a whole bunch of other fiduciary duties. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you and the company are separate legal entities. So that if, say for instance, the business was to be wound up and it had debts, etc., and sometimes that does happen with businesses. Well, more often than not, 80% of businesses fail within the first 5 years. Then at least you're not personally liable for the debts of the business if it's a company. But if you're a sole trader, you personally are responsible for all those debts. Companies have been used very well by successful businesses for many, many centuries. It's a very, very good way of protecting the business owner or owners from personal bankruptcy or other financial stress as a result of the business going under, and then debtors coming after the business owner, or the business, which equals the business owner. At the end of the day, you'll need to pay those debts back, or if you can't pay those debts, then there's a possibility of bankruptcy, which most people, and having their personal assets at stake, at risk, house, etc. It's a really scary situation that I've had to guide clients through, and if only they had incorporated sooner, it's one of those mistakes that you would only make once. Best not to make it in the first place. Look to incorporate straight away. We don't do incorporations ourselves. We leave that up to accountants to do. This is just information for you, because I've seen so many businesses that really ought to have set up a separate legal entity right from the start. The other thing that you've got to consider as well too is that once a business starts to grow, the business starts to have value. And once you move a business from a sole trader to a company, it becomes a lot harder the longer you go on to demonstrate if the Australian Tax Office was to say, well, hold on a second, you've incorporated, this business has changed. Surely that business has value. The assets have moved from one legal entity to another, and then having to explain to the ATO why the value of those assets or those business, intellectual property, goodwill, trademarks, etc., all these things that a business amasses over a period of time, when they get transferred to the company, why wouldn't tax be applicable on that transfer? And also too, when those things are disposed, is there a capital gains tax event? So these are the things, unfortunately, that a lot of people don't get the advice about. And when they get a business that goes through the roof, then suddenly all these things start to really become difficult to deal with. And usually I find by the time that an accountant says to you, hey, it's time to move from a sole trader to a company, things are very busy. It's a very busy business. You're doing more than 600 grand turnover, $1 million turnover, etc. And they're saying, hey, we need to incorporate now because you're going to be paying too much tax on an individual basis. So you really need, and usually we find it's like moving at Christmas, and you'll be surprised, just like when you have to move house, how much stuff you've accumulated over that time that needs to be transferred, and often, boxes get left, and things go missing. So it's best to do it right from the start, or do it as soon as possible when things aren't as busy. The other thing as well is all of the contracts that you've entered into need to be changed. All the legal stuff needs to be changed. Your insurances, the workers' comp, even you need a new Xero if you're using a Xero software for your finance. All the software needs to be changed over. All this stuff you don't sort of get, you don't think about at the time, but then when you need to go through it yourself, it's really painful. So it's best to do it early as possible, and just so that the consequences aren't as big later down the track. In any event, if you know this is a business, it's a goer, it's a proper business, you're going to need to be a company at some stage anyway. Best to do it when as soon as possible. If you're okay with paying a little bit extra for the setup and compliance aspects of it. Happy to have a chat with any business owner about this and just guide them and get some proper advice from an accountant, knowing once they've got advice from the lawyer, say, yes, there's enough legal risk in the business. My lawyers told me this, really should have a separate legal entity. Accountants usually say, okay, fine. If there's a legal, if there are legal risks here, then let's incorporate sooner rather than later. That should override the financial, tax benefits, at that point in time, or costs. Happy to have a chat. Thanks.